A quiet morning in rural Nebraska. If you ever wake up in the heartland of Nebraska, the air is different. Crisp, a little bit sweet, painted with the scent of wildflowers and fresh-cut grass. There's a hush to the world here, as if the prairies themselves are still dreaming while the sun peeks over endless cornfields. Roads are just two lines vanishing into the horizon, and homes, like that of Jack Anderson and his wife Mia, stand alone, modest but dignified among the patchwork of green and gold. On this particular morning in late May, the Andersons' little white house on the outskirts of Red Oak glowed softly in the first rays of daybreak. The familiar creak of their wooden porch, the gentle clatter of wind chimes, and the lazy wag of their golden retriever Max's tail were sounds and sights the neighbors had come to recognize over the past year. The Andersons were the picture of young, small-town hope, newly married, recently opened up a barbecue shack that, as rumor had it, was on its way to being the best in 3 counties. They were ambitious, but not loud about it, practical, hard-working, and always ready with a smile, the kind of folks who'd bring over pie for a sick neighbor or greet the mailman by name. Life in Red Oak didn't often rush. People woke slow. By 6:30, Jack would usually have the grill fired up out back, prepping brisket, while Mia made coffee and readied the day's bread. Their families, mostly living within a few miles, often dropped by. Their parents still carried a sense of old Midwestern worry, never quite able to let go of their children, even when they'd grown up and carved a life of their own. On this morning, birds were already chattering in the cottonwoods, and the ring of the church bell from Main Street would soon call folks to breakfast. Out beyond the yard, the Andersons' old Ford pickup sat in its usual place, a thin veil of dew on the windshield. Inside, a half-finished crossword puzzle, Mia's tomato plants lined the kitchen windowsill, and leftover barbecue sauce jars piled by the sink. Yet, something in the air felt different. In small towns, it doesn't take much for whispers to drift from one porch to another. Someone driving past noticed the Andersons' porch light still on long after sunrise. Others swore they'd heard Max barking through the night, something he almost never did, unless a coyote strayed too close to the chicken coop. The little routines, the tiny rhythms that made up Nebraska mornings, seemed ever so gently out of step. Step outside, and the place looked unchanged, peaceful as it gets. But for those who knew the Andersons, the silence held a question. Where were Jack and Mia, whose laughter and busy activity usually set the tone for the whole street? And why did their home, always so welcoming, seem suddenly locked up inside itself, holding its breath as the sun climbed higher? A mother's quiet. Worry. The morning sun cast gentle shadows across Mary Anderson's kitchen as she methodically prepared pancakes, the fluffy kind Jack loved ever since he was a child. She moved about her tasks with a practiced, deliberate calm, but her eyes kept glancing toward the clock above the fridge. Every tick seemed to echo louder than the last. For weeks now, she'd grown used to the routine. Tuesdays, the Anderson kids came by for breakfast, sometimes earlier if Jack had work at the shack, sometimes later if Mia baked fresh muffins. And every Tuesday, without fail, Mary would set the table for 4, pouring orange juice and humming softly to herself, remembering how little Jack would tug at her skirt for more syrup. Today, though, the couple was nowhere to be found. Their chairs were empty, gathering dust motes in the morning light. At first, Mary shrugged it off. Young people these days, maybe they finally decided to sleep in, or maybe the work week caught up to them. But as the hands swept past 8 a.m., then 9, her unease grew. She dialed Jack's number, tapping her foot on the linoleum, but calls went unanswered. Mia's phone rang into a void. Mary tried to still her heart, telling herself it was nothing, but Nebraska mothers, especially farm mothers, trust instinct above all. Over the years, she had learned a thing or two about worry, She'd worried about Jack as a feverish boy, as a senior heading off to state fair, as a groom trembling before that little country church. But nothing felt quite like this. A hollow dread settling in, heavy and unshakable. The silence wasn't just odd, it was wrong. She looked out the kitchen window, watched the curtains flutter in the wind, and realized she hadn't heard Max barking that morning. The house across the field, always alive with movement, stood oddly still. Now her mind began racing through scenarios. Maybe Jack and Mia drove into town and lost track of time. Maybe their phones died. Maybe they ran out of gas on Highway 30. But the longer Mary waited, the more her confidence dissolved. Because mothers know, with a quiet certainty, when the world shifts beneath their feet. Soon Mary set the pancake pan aside, wiped her hands on her apron, and made her decision. If her children weren't coming to her, she'd go to them. With trembling hands, she picked up her keys and headed out, a whisper of fear casting a shadow over the warm Nebraska morning. An empty house and strange clues. When Mary Anderson finally pulled up beside her son's modest farmhouse on the edge of Red Oak, she couldn't shake the feeling of unease clinging to her like the morning fog. The driveway looked just as it always had, an old tricycle half buried in clover, the mailbox open as if left in a hurry, the Andersons' battered pickup gleaming with fresh dew. But as she climbed out, a hush pressed down. No barking from Max, no curtain moving at the kitchen window, none of Mia's cheerful waves or Jack's familiar call. Only the uneasy flapping of a wind-blown feed sack and the constant lowing of a neighbor's cow far in the distance. Mary pushed open the front door, surprised to find it unlocked. The doormat was askew and muddy shoe prints, larger than Jack's, dotted the steps inside. She called out, her voice echoing through the halls and drifting unanswered into the rooms. Inside, it was colder than she expected, the kind of chill that comes from more than just weather. The air hung heavy with the smell of half-burnt coffee and something else. Iron? Dust. There was a pot of stew on the kitchen table, still open and untouched, its surface filmed over from sitting too long. A mess of drawers yanked open, papers scattered, and the refrigerator door left ajar pointed to some kind of frantic search. In the tidy living room, Mia's knitting basket lay overturned, needles poking like insect legs into the rug, where Jack's crossword puzzle lay untouched beside a mug gone cold. She moved through the house, every detail now shouting its wrongness. The bedroom door was half open, but the bed was stripped down to the bare mattress. No sheets, no quilt, not even the faded patchwork blanket Mia and Mary had quilted the winter before. In the bathroom, wet towels sprawled on the tile, and muddy footprints led into the back hallway. The back door, normally bolted tight, was unlocked, and the little side window had a crack in the frame that hadn't been there the week before. As Mary wandered out onto the back porch, her eyes landed on something that made her heart freeze. Max, the family dog, lay unmoving in the far corner near the chicken coop. He had been a loyal companion for years, and seeing him like that, unable to bark a warning or come wagging for a treat, made dread bloom in her chest. It wasn't just a dog lying in an odd spot. There was a sharp, final stillness to Max. Someone had silenced him for a reason. Trying desperately to steady herself, Mary made her way back into the kitchen, the same place where her son had learned to bake cookies, and Mia had once danced barefoot on a rainy spring night. Looking around, every sign told her the Anderson home, usually so warm and full of life, now stood like a cold shell. Mary realized whatever had happened here, it wasn't an accident or the result of absent-mindedness. There was no sign of a struggle, only the chilling absence of the people she loved most, and traces of careful, hurried hands erasing the normalcy of life as she knew it. Trembling, Mary recognized it was time to get help. Something unspeakable had swept through their little world, leaving behind not just an empty house, but a mystery, chilling and silent, demanding to be solved. Law enforcement steps. In Sheriff Bradley West had seen his share of rural trouble in Oak County, runaway cattle, bickering neighbors, even the odd winter break-in that could be solved with a polite chat. But standing in the crisp Nebraska dawn outside the Anderson homestead, with the worried faces of neighbors lingering on the other side of the fence and an unusual hush in the air, he immediately knew this was different. The call from Mary Anderson had come in tense and shaky. She described the empty house, the upturned drawers, and the terrible silence, the kind of details that never showed up in a routine missing persons case. Deputy Ramirez arrived first and methodically went through the front yard, pausing before the porch as if reading the morning's news in the dew set on the steps. She was soon joined by Sheriff West, who only needed one glance at Mary's face, pale and pinched with dread, to know the family was not just overreacting. Something was wrong. Very wrong. Armed with the authority and a battered brown notebook, Sheriff West led the team into the Andersons' home. They did a careful walk-through. The front door, although unlocked, looked scratched and stretched near the latch. Drawing on years of experience, Deputy Ramirez quietly pointed out a muddy boot print at the entryway. They saw how each room bore the tension of hands moving through in haste, knickknacks swept aside, kitchen drawers left dangling, a tumble of receipts and grocery lists strewn on the kitchen table. But the refrigerator door, nudged open and leaking cold air, and the stew cooling on the stove, somehow felt more foreboding. This wasn't just a robbery. It was as if someone had gone looking for something, or hiding from something, before vanishing into thin air. The officers took careful notes and photographs, cataloging every detail. When they discovered that the Andersons' recently installed surveillance cameras were missing, with only the monitor left untouched, Sheriff West's sense of unease grew into something colder. He knew this wasn't the work of some bored teenager or small-time thief. The missing hard drive, arguably more valuable in information than any television or laptop, suggested the perpetrator knew exactly what they were doing and wanted all evidence erased. The investigation stepped up a beat. The sheriff's radio crackled as field deputies secured the perimeter, talking with neighbors, scanning for tire tracks or unfamiliar vehicles. Any hope that Jack and Mia would soon walk through the door faded with each passing hour. Every officer in that humble farmhouse understood the urgency. In cases like this, time was the enemy, and every minute lost meant answers grew farther out of reach. Forensics would comb the house, while Mary Anderson sat on the porch, anxiously twisting her apron and staring out at the gently swaying fields. All she could do now was wait, and trust that the law, with all its limits, might bring her children back safely. But as Sheriff West looked around, he knew this investigation was only beginning. Out here, amid the stillness of Nebraska, an unspeakable mystery was unfolding, one that would soon test every ounce of resolve the community had to give. The painful truth. Revealed. The Andersons' quiet farmhouse, once the symbol of all things good and simple about Nebraska country life, became an active crime scene, where every square foot was scrutinized for answers. As the investigation deepened, it was no longer just the anxious heartbeats of a mother or a community's dread at an unsolved disappearance. There was now growing, tangible evidence that pointed toward an altogether darker narrative, one straining the boundaries of disbelief, even for seasoned law enforcement. Forensic teams arrived at dawn, their arrival marked by the dull hum of police vehicles and the sharp, practiced voices of detectives. The Anderson home, previously bustling with the smells of brisket and warm bread, now echoed faintly with radio chatter and the measured snapping of latex gloves as technicians set about their work. They moved with methodical urgency, collecting fibers, swabbing for DNA, and dusting for prints along the battered entrance and scattered kitchen. It was quickly apparent that random theft was not the sole, or even primary, motive. The kitchen told a story. A pot left on the stove, bread gone stale on the counter, coffee in the carafe, now cold and bitter. Someone had interrupted the day's natural order. Drawers were emptied, papers scattered, but valuable electronics and jewelry had been overlooked. What stood out, as the forensic team combed through the living room, was the absence of the newly installed security system. A hard drive, gone, with cables yanked straight from the case. It was targeted. Someone didn't want what those cameras saw to ever come to light. A sickening detail was discovered in the Andersons' bedroom. A wedding quilt, the pride of Mary and Mia's winter handiwork, thrown to the floor and spattered with faint, rusty stains that glowed under the forensic light. On further inspection, a torn undergarment was found beneath the bed. There was no sign of Jack or Mia, but each clue seemed to shout a silent warning. Something unspeakably violent had happened here, hidden beneath the everyday. The technical specialists used luminol to make the faint traces of blood bloom in fluorescent blue, along wall trims and the hardwood floor. It was as though life itself had been forcibly and brutally wiped away from this small, beloved home. In the haze of activity, a careful mapping of shoe prints revealed at least 3 different pairs that didn't match any belonging to Jack or Mia. The evidence was irrefutable. This wasn't a robbery gone wrong, and it wasn't a simple case of 2 adults wandering off. This was calculated, prepared, its every step hinting at a chilling degree of cruelty. By the river just beyond the Anderson property, officers searching for any sign of the missing couple stumbled upon several oversized black trash bags, half submerged in reeds and mud. Inside were shredded bits of paperwork. Jack and Mia's marriage certificate, battered IDs, blood-stained clothing, and most damningly, an abandoned bank card. These finds painted a ghastly picture, not just an attempt to erase evidence, but to erase the couple's very presence and identities from the world. Back at the farmhouse, word of the horrific discoveries rippled through the assembled officers. A team was sent to widen the search. Footprints along the muddy bank led away into the low, wild brush, a terrifying sign that the violence endured by the Andersons had not ended quickly, nor without intent. As the sun rose higher over the Nebraska landscape, illuminating the tranquil fields, the contrast with the grim work beneath its light could not have been starker. Evil had swept through Red Oak, and its touch was everywhere. CSI photographers carefully documented the scene: the broken window pane, the haphazardly emptied dresser drawers, the fingernail scratches along an otherwise spotless windowsill that no one remembered from before. Fragments of Mia's favorite mug, shattered in the sink, were bagged as evidence. A simple heart-shaped handle, now a symbol of what once was. Time seemed to slow as the police mapped every inch of the home for trace evidence, desperate for answers that would bring peace to both Mary and the community she represented. The emotional toll was evident. Mary Anderson waited on the porch, her world shrinking with every passing hour, clutching her son's old baseball cap to her chest. Friends and neighbors, who just yesterday had shared news about the Andersons' barbecue shack, now spoke in hushed tones, afraid of what the next moment might bring. No one in Red Oak could recall a crime so violent. The shockwave rattled through the church, the diner, the feed store alike. Then, as detectives rechecked the local riverbank, an elderly cattleman, a fixture of the Red Oak outskirts known for never missing an unusual sight, approached with an unsettling story. He'd seen 4 unfamiliar men lingering by the abandoned stone cave near the western woods, acting furtive and glancing back toward the Anderson property. When pressed by officers, he described their vehicle and demeanor with remarkable precision, setting off a new flurry of activity in the police ranks. It was now irrefutable. Jack and Mia were victims of a calculated and deeply personal crime, the details of which would unfold into something that gripped the entire county. As the morning edged into noon, the only certainty was heartbreak. Mourning families, a shocked sheriff and his deputies, neighbors whose sleep would never again be as peaceful as before, all waited for the inevitable, final confirmation of the unthinkable. Chilling clues along the riverbank. By the time early afternoon sunlight bled through the clouds, the Anderson property and its surrounding fields had become a focal point of urgency, fear, and scrutiny. Everyone, from the forensic analysts in their white coveralls to the quiet neighbors peering from behind their curtains, felt the atmosphere shift from anxious hope to the hard edge of dread. But it was the call from 2 deputies stationed at the property's edge, where the land curved down toward a brush-choked riverbank, that snapped the tension into a new, even colder reality. The deputies' discovery seemed straight out of a rural nightmare. Wedged between tangled reeds and the mossy roots of a half-fallen willow tree, they found several large industrial trash bags, awkwardly heavy and bursting at their seams. The bags had been marred by mud and the clawing of raccoons, but when the officers carefully opened them, the air was punctuated by that sharp, coppery tang of fear and loss. There, scattered among the contents, were items so personal and damning they instantly shifted the case from a missing persons investigation to something far darker. Inside the bags were papers ripped lengthwise, Jack and Mia's marriage certificate, battered driver's licenses, a crumpled Social Security card, and even a checkbook with their signatures. There were clothes, some familiar from family photos, torn, soaked, and in places unmistakably stained with blood. Most jarring of all was a debit card, still slick with silt, the name Jack Anderson printed on its front as if to declare the horror's reality. The officers swabbed the bag's interiors, bagged every fragment for DNA and fingerprint analysis, and called in the senior crime scene technician. The larger police team, already running on adrenaline and too little sleep, convened quickly on the riverbank with portable light towers and evidence tents. Sheriff West, jaw set and voice tight, directed them personally, sensing instinctively that answers about motive, sequence, and identity might lie in these bags. Even the most experienced deputies felt their stomachs turn as they gathered each fragment of torn, blood-marked fabric. The tags matched departmental records of what Mia wore the day she vanished. There were receipts, a torn grocery list, and a child's drawing from the Andersons' fridge, now stained and illegible. Every item was an agonizing echo of everyday routine forever lost, evidence both of the couple's domestic hopes and of their sudden and brutal erasure from the world. The investigation slowly spread outward from the riverbank. Detectives traced footprints, several distinct patterns, some booted and others in worn sneakers, pressed deep into the mud. The size and direction confirmed that more than one perpetrator had been present, and that these individuals had entered and exited the brush in haste. Photographs were painstakingly taken of every indentation, with markers set down, while dogs sniffed along possible trails of disturbed grass. Just upstream, lodged beneath a drift of deadwood, they uncovered a torn scrap of blue cloth. Several members of the team remembered seeing Jack wear a similar shirt at neighborhood barbecue events. Forensic technicians swabbed the fabric and logged it carefully. The presence of multiple traces, blood, hair, small flecks of skin, suggested a struggle, perhaps an attempt to escape, or maybe a last, desperate moment of resistance by Jack or Mia. Further along the sloped riverbank, searchers spotted new evidence almost overlooked in the undergrowth. A shoelace, broken and mud-caked, wrapped around a sapling, and a set of keys glinting dully beneath pine needles. The keys, tagged and run through the county inventory, matched the Andersons' truck. If the attackers had tried to dump the keys, perhaps to buy themselves time or to mislead investigators, why leave them so conspicuously close? The question added to the growing sense that the violence committed here was both rushed and chaotic, yet also methodical in the removal and almost ritualistic destruction of identity documents. Word of these discoveries traveled fast. Mary Anderson, waiting deep in her grief on the farmhouse porch, saw the sheriff's grim face as he relayed news to her. No detail could soften the blow. Everything pointed toward the deliberate attempt not just to kill, but to wipe away proof that Jack and Mia had ever lived here at all. Even the objects left behind seemed to vibrate with a cold malice. The technical team's work continued deep into the afternoon. Using ultraviolet lamps and scent-detecting equipment, they swept the brush and rocks along the water's edge for additional clues. Tiny glass fragments, possibly from the missing security cameras, were collected and bagged for analysis. Each new piece of evidence painted a picture that was cruelly meticulous. The perpetrators seemed intent on removing anything that could help piece together the events, except ironically for the trail of evidence left in their panic. Officers fanned out, combing through the wider area. Across the water, a muddy handprint on a fallen log caught the eye of one young deputy. It was large, likely from an adult male, and it was new. The forensics team documented the print, dusted it, and photographed every angle before carefully taking a sample. The handprint seemed to be pointing, almost accusingly, back toward the Anderson property itself, as if the victim or even an attacker had tried to steady themselves or flee during those final frantic moments. By now, the mood among the investigators was somber but relentless. Nobody voiced what they were all feeling, that every new clue sharpened the tragedy, making it feel more real, more monstrous. The scene at the riverbank, the personal belongings, the blood-stained clothes, the shredded documents, felt like part of a macabre ritual meant to erase not only lives, but presence, memory, and even love. Every single deputy, technician, and officer faced an internal struggle. How to do their jobs with diligence and keep themselves from being destroyed by what they saw. As dusk approached, the relentless search started to yield subtle but important details. Tucked under a fallen fence post, detectives found a brand new lighter engraved with unfamiliar initials, later determined not to belong to anyone in the Anderson family. When tested, the lighter held microscopic residues matching accelerant chemicals, the same kind hinted at in the burned marks found on Mia's clothing. The lighter became a focal point, possibly left by one of the perpetrators, or even intentionally placed to send a message. The emotional toll of the investigation became brutally visible, especially when the officers had to gently relay findings to Mary Anderson and the extended family. For the community, the riverbank was no longer a quiet spot for fishing or summer picnics, but had transformed into a place of horror and mourning. The sheriff's department put up a perimeter with tarps and floodlights as darkness fell, signifying both a crime scene and a sanctuary for evidence now sacred in its tragic importance. By the time the last evidence was bagged for the night, it was painfully clear to everyone, both law enforcement and the family, that this case had crossed a line no one could ever walk back. The chilling clues left behind were more than just remnants of violence. They were a grim testament to what had been shattered forever and what would haunt Red Oak, Nebraska, for years to come. A horrifying discovery inside the cave when Sheriff Bradley West finally received the anxious radio call from his deputy. The tension was already at fever pitch. Locals in Red Oak had whispered for generations about the old stone cave out by the western woods, a landmark from ancient times, weathered and half hidden by hawthorn and vines. But never had it been more than a place for childhood dares, or, at worst, secret teenage bonfires. Now, it loomed as the final dreadful chapter in the Anderson story. The team of officers, accompanied by forensic specialists and a search dog, approached the entrance cautiously, flashlights bouncing over twisted roots and slick moss. The air inside was heavy, almost suffocating, a clammy darkness that seemed to swallow all hope. Nothing could have prepared them for what waited in the shadows just beyond the first chamber of the cave. Jack and Mia Anderson's bodies lay there, stripped of dignity and nearly beyond recognition. Jack's wrists and ankles were bound with heavy cord, eyelids closed as though still willing himself to wake from this nightmare. His jaw had been broken. His face and chest bore the telltale bruises of repeated blows. Gaffer's tape sealed his mouth and nose, the cruelty of suffocation etched in the desperate arch of his back. But it was Mia who bore the greatest scars, the kind that made even hardened lawmen and veteran paramedics lose their composure. Her arms and torso were covered in half-healed welts, cigarette burns, and multiple stab wounds, some shallow, others deep and bleeding into the tattered remains of her dress. Her hands were broken, indicating she'd fought fiercely. Even through unimaginable pain, she had not gone quietly. Dried tears streaked her face, mingling with blood and earth. The scene suggested prolonged torture and a systematic campaign of brutality. Forensic analysis began immediately. Luminol sprayed over the cave walls, exposed patterns of blood splatter, some high up near the horseshoe-shaped arch, others trailing toward the ground. This evidence implied intense struggle. Jack and Mia had tried desperately to resist their captors, to survive in any way possible. Surrounding the bodies, investigators found personal effects that at once made the event heartbreakingly real. Mia's locket, still clasped, had a photo of her and Jack on their wedding day, now spattered with blood. Jack's battered watch, smashed but still faintly ticking, had stopped at 2:17 a.m., an ominous hint at the timeline. Fragments of rope and duct tape, marred with fingerprints and DNA from multiple assailants, were collected as crucial evidence. On the rocky ground, one of the search team picked up scraps of soiled cloth that matched clothing seen in family photos, the shredded remains of Jack's favorite red flannel shirt and Mia's floral summer dress. Nearby, a muddy footprint with a unique tread imprint was preserved in plaster. Forensics hoped it might match the boots of one of the suspects. The cave's interior revealed as much about the psychological profile of the attackers as it did their actions. Graffiti adorned one stone wall, crude symbols, the names of the probable perpetrators, and taunts crudely scratched with a knife. There were energy drink cans, wrappers, and traces of cheap liquor, suggesting the group had lingered, taking their time with unspeakable acts. Half-burned photographs of Jack and Mia, likely stolen from their home, were jammed near the site. An attempt, perhaps, to destroy all traces of the life they had built. Crime scene technicians spent hours meticulously cataloging the space. Swabs were taken from under Mia's fingernails. Tissue caught on a jagged stone, likely belonged to one of the assailants. Hair strands of varying lengths did not match either victim. On the far side of the cave, a bloody crowbar was discovered, with both blood and fibers adhering, and a set of car keys with a worn family photo in the keychain, confirming that the Andersons had not left willingly. Deputies stood watch outside as news of the find spread quickly across police radio bands. Months of tension and worry, condensed now into a single, shared moment of grief and anger. Sheriff West conferred with his team, careful as they pieced together interviews and search results, knowing that each clue inside the cave would make a world of difference at trial. Word soon reached Mary Anderson, who collapsed silently on her porch swing, rocking herself as the magnitude of her loss set in. Neighbors gathered quietly at the edge of the Anderson property, mourning in solidarity and disbelief. For Red, Oak, and especially the Anderson family, the cave was now more than local lore. It was a site of horror and heartache that would never be forgotten. In the days that followed, lab analysis of evidence from the cave identified DNA profiles of all 4 suspects, matching blood, sweat, and skin cells, as well as fingerprints and even a partial shoe print identical to the one previously found by the riverbank. Case against the criminal gang would be airtight. Yet, for all the academic satisfaction of precision and procedure, not a single soul involved in the rescue and recovery would ever fully recover. They had looked at the abyss and found a darkness that reached deeper than any shadow in Nebraska's forgotten caves. The pain lingered, the questions multiplied, but the certainty was fixed. The Andersons' final hours had been a test of the very worst impulses of humanity, and a cry for justice that demanded to be met with the full weight of the law. The criminal network exposed. The investigation into Jack and Mia Anderson's disappearance had already thrown Red Oak into shock, but nothing prepared the community or the law enforcement for what emerged next. As the technical team meticulously combed through the mountain of evidence, bloodstained documents, destroyed personal artifacts, the chilling clues from the riverbank and cave, new patterns began to surface, exposing the dark roots of a broader criminal underworld running straight through small-town Nebraska. It wasn't just about two lives anymore. It was about a web of fear and manipulation that reached further and deeper than anyone suspected. The first real crack in the quiet veneer came when forensic analysts traced a series of bank withdrawals made with Jack Anderson's stolen card in the hours after the crime. Surveillance footage from small-town ATMs, grocery stores, and even a lonely gas station on the state line captured fleeting images of unfamiliar faces. Young men, eyes darting, faces obscured by baseball caps and hoodies. Each transaction brought with it timestamps and locations, quickly allowing detectives to plot the movement of Jack's card across dozens of rural miles. These weren't random acts. They were coordinated, careful, and coldly opportunistic. Cross-referencing the footage with DMV records, police began to assemble a list of potential suspects. It was then that Deputy Ramirez made a breakthrough. Hidden deep beneath the blood-stained jeans found near the river was a Social Security card, stiff with dried mud and overlooked in the first frantic hours of evidence gathering. The name on that card was not Jack's, nor Mia's, but belonged instead to a local troublemaker recently released from county jail, Mike Foster. Mike Foster's criminal record painted a familiar and troubling picture. Barely 26, his file included juvenile delinquency, grand theft auto, domestic violence, and suspected ties to petty drug trafficking. But what chilled the police most was his influence over younger, more impressionable members of the local community. He wasn't the cliché of a hardened city gangster, but the self-styled kingpin of a loose gang of drifters and dropouts, each seemingly searching for purpose in a world that had little to offer. Among those most closely linked to Mike were Jimmy Brooks, a wiry, quick-tempered kid who'd bounced foster homes, and Steve Miller, whose academic promise had long since curdled into apathy and anger. Bringing up the rear was Kane Thomas, barely out of school, known more for his nervous silences and quick fingers than for any real menace. But together, under Mike's shadow, they formed a dangerous and unpredictable pack. The deeper police dug, the more criminal connections they uncovered. Over the previous year, reports of burglaries, assaults, and even cattle rustling had gone unsolved in the Tri-County area. Scraps of evidence now led back to these same four men. A boot print behind Red Oak's community bank mirrored the tread found outside the Andersons' house. A witness, reviewing police lineups, recognized Jimmy Brooks from a long-ago gas station holdup. Phone records, obtained under warrants and trawled through night after night, linked countless calls and texts between Foster and his lieutenants, often timed right before or after a local crime. Piecing the chain together became a feverish, round-the-clock mission for law enforcement. Probing further into their financial transactions, police uncovered a pattern. After every violent incident or theft, cash was withdrawn and promptly gambled away at out-of-state casinos, spent on cheap motels, or wired to unlikely addresses. The men's digital footprints showed a fascination for true crime forums, dark web chat rooms, and boastful posts under anonymous handles about living free and taking what they wanted from a society that had always, at least in their telling, shut them out. That blend of bravado and resentment made them uniquely dangerous, especially when paired with the real-world violence they inflicted without warning or remorse. The mechanics of the Anderson crime came into focus with painful clarity. Mike Foster had tracked Jack and Mia for weeks, learning their routines, testing neighborhood reactions by throwing rocks late at night or letting off fireworks. Reports from other small towns in the region, newly reviewed with fresh urgency, described the same battered pickup spotted near break-ins and vandalized churches. Police determined that the group's plan all along was not just to rob, but to utterly terrorize, an ongoing game for power and notoriety, fueled by boredom, resentment, and the promise of easy money. Through coordinated efforts with other county sheriff's offices and state police, Oak County investigators assembled a profile of the gang's methods. Always attack by night, always wear gloves, always yank out any home surveillance. They entered homes, through windows or doors forced open with a crowbar, worked fast, spoke little, and left the kind of quiet destruction that would confuse and delay response. Whenever possible, they targeted homes far from main roads, places where cries for help would be muffled by distance and darkness. On a cold Thursday morning, all these threads collided. Mike Foster's battered sedan was seen by a highway patrolman at a rest stop outside Lincoln. Plates matched those flagged in the Anderson file. Through careful shadowing and a coordinated roadblock, police finally brought the car to a halt. Inside, all four men sat silent and resigned, their pockets stuffed with cash, scratch tickets, burner phones, and, most damningly, a roll of duct tape, identical to the kind found at the Anderson crime scene. Jimmy Brooks tried to run. Kane Thomas cried. In the end, it took less than 10 minutes for the gang's brief, brutal freedom to collapse. The arrest ignited a storm of coverage both local and national. For Red Oak, it was a moment of relief overshadowed by unresolved grief. The community gathered at candlelight vigils and prayer services to honor Jack and Mia, but also to reckon with the uncomfortable reality. In their midst, beneath the small-town routines of cookouts and school board meetings, a cancer had grown. The criminal ring had not only claimed 2 innocent lives, but shattered the illusion that violence and malice were things that only happened somewhere else. As the criminal process whirred into motion, interrogations, arraignment hearings, the assembling of overwhelming evidence, one last sinister layer emerged. Mike Foster, emboldened by press attention, bragged to fellow inmates about their exploits. But jailhouse confessions echoed beyond the bars, revealing that Jack and Mia, unlucky but random targets, were meant to be one of many. The gang had drawn up a grim list of future victims, homes to hit next. Thanks to swift action and mounting evidence, the chain had been broken. But the aftershocks would echo in Red Oak for years, a story of heartbreak, vigilance, and, above all, the necessity for light to chase out the darkest corners of American life. The truth about the Notorious gang. Discovering the identities and backstories of the 4 men behind the Anderson tragedy brought a new and chilling layer to the investigation. As the detectives pored over social records, school files, and interviews, a complex mosaic of failure, darkness, and lost potential came into focus. A cautionary tale woven into the broader narrative of rural America's struggles. The ringleader, Mike Foster, grew up just 20 miles from Red Oak, in a faded farmhouse on the wrong side of a dying county road. His childhood, once filled with local baseball games and Sunday school, slowly devolved after his father's imprisonment for petty larceny. By high school, Mike's attendance dwindled as he cycled through run-ins with the law, vandalism at age 13, a stolen bike at 14, his first car theft at 16. Teachers recalled a boy who was quick-witted and mechanically gifted, but lured away by the adrenaline of risk and the camaraderie of misfits. In the years preceding the Anderson case, Mike had spent stretches in juvenile detention and county jail, each stay hardening his conviction that society owed him nothing but contempt. His closest accomplice, Jimmy Brooks, was Red Oak's cautionary tale of foster care gone wrong. Abandoned by his mother and with no known father, Jimmy never spent 2 consecutive years in the same school or home, a litany of closed doors and distant, impersonal counseling sessions. By his late teens, he'd become infamous for midnight borrowing of farm vehicles, fighting on gravel roads, and disappearing for weeks at a time. Somewhere in his volatile temperament, those who knew him said, was a desperate hunger for approval, met only by the twisted encouragement of men like Mike Foster. The third member, Steve Miller, had been regarded as a promising student in his middle school years. Quiet, but with a knack for science projects and woodworking. That path veered dramatically when his parents divorced, and he began skipping school, falling in with older boys who introduced him to drinking and petty theft. Steve's brush with a serious accident in a stolen car at 17 left a deep scar, both physically and in the eyes of his community. Afterward, he seemed to vanish, living on odd jobs, sleeping in abandoned sheds, his anger burning under the surface. Finally, there was Kane Thomas, the youngest, barely out of high school, who had grown up in a trailer on the outskirts of town. Kane hardly spoke to those outside his crew, known at best for his nervous silences and hair-trigger moods. Poor grades, frequent absences, and a mother too sick to work left him isolated. Local authorities lamented that Kane might have been saved if anyone could have reached him in time. But by the time he fell in with Mike, he was already hardened, eager for approval, and desperate for belonging. What stitched these 4 together was more than just economic hardship or troubled family trees. Detectives saw it in the group's digital footprint, shared web searches for notorious crimes, joined forums on the dark web devoted to living recklessly, and streams of aggressive social media posts railing against injustice, authority, and the lies of the American dream. It was a swirling brew of rage, ennui, and nihilism, a self-fulfilling prophecy stoked by isolated nights and the cold blue glow of cheap smartphones. For months, the 4 drifted between Red Oak and surrounding towns, holding no steady jobs, their hands uncalloused by honest labor. Instead, they found kinship in each other's resentment. Together they became sharper, crueler, and bolder, the kind of men no one noticed until it was too late. The final reports showed they had scouted, harassed, and taunted other locals before. A series of burglaries, vandalized barns, livestock gone missing, even a fire at a shut-down filling station. In most cases, law enforcement dismissed these as separate petty crimes, never guessing they were part of an escalating thrill for the same 4 men. What started as impulse, let's break in and take what we can carry, quickly mutated into depravity. Inside their makeshift hideouts, police found notebooks with crude sketches of Red Oak and notes scoring local homes by risk and reward. Many pages showed the Anderson house marked with red stars, evidence of a plan months in the making. Interviews with old friends and family revealed another truth. These men weren't born monstrous, but shaped by abandonment, absence, and countless missed opportunities. Mike's mother, who last spoke to him from a court-holding cell, sobbed that for a while her son had wanted to become a mechanic. Jimmy's social worker remembered his fear of being forgotten. Steve's little brother spoke of late-night stories of running away from punishment. Each backstory was a fragment of rural malaise, poverty, mental illness, and generational trauma looping through lives with no intervention strong enough to halt the slide. A forensic psychologist, brought in during the trial preparation, outlined that their evolution from reckless boys to violent criminals had not been sudden but inevitable without interruption. The thrill of transgression, coupled with isolation and mutual validation, had created a psychological pack, a brotherhood bound not by love, but by shared pain and a drive to strike out against a world they saw as hostile. As the extent of their crimes became public, Red Oak mourned not only the Andersons, but the social failings that had given rise to such darkness. Community leaders called for more robust social services, mentoring programs, and trauma-informed care to ensure that a new generation was not lost to the same spiral. In newspaper editorials and at town hall meetings, parents discussed mental health, school funding, and stronger community policing, hoping for lessons learned too late for Jack and Mia, but not for everyone else. Ultimately, as photos flashed and stories circulated in national news, the four men became infamous, not as mythic outlaws, but as broken reflections of a rural America struggling under economic strain, loneliness, and the collapse of old support structures. Their trial would be measured as much in tears for their victims as in hard questions about how a small, peaceful town could harbor such a concentrated evil in plain sight. And in the silence left behind, one thing rang clear. The truth about this notorious gang was not just about their crime, but about what happens when a community lets its most vulnerable boys slip through the cracks, unnoticed, until all that's left is shared ruin and regret. Their chilling, calculated crime. The full scope of the gang's monstrous plan unfolded only through painstaking investigation, far darker and more chilling than anyone in Red Oak could imagine. By the time police reconstructed all the steps, it was clear their crime wasn't a mere spur-of-the-moment burst of violence. Rather, it was a carefully laid, almost ritualistic plot driven by opportunity, hatred, and a macabre hunger for notoriety. For weeks before the attack, Mike Foster and his cohorts watched the Anderson house. They mapped Jack and Mia's routines, the early morning movements when the barbecue shack closed, how often the family came over, when the couple usually retired for the night. They noted if the porch light stayed on, if Max the dog was let out or chained up, even tracking church bells and neighborhood foot traffic. Their aim was to find a night when the Andersons would be most isolated. It was Steve Miller, the former promising science student, who came up with the plan's harsh logistics. He posted online in anonymous forums, seeking advice on how best to erase digital evidence. Together, the group started studying burglary playbooks shared by other criminals on the dark web. How to cut home security systems, obscure entry via back doors, and confuse police by destroying evidence or staging the scene. Every one of them contributed. Jimmy Brooks brought his experience with forced entry and vehicle theft. Kane Thomas, the nerves and willingness to prove himself. Mike, the cold-blooded leadership that stitched the whole act together. The gang's preparation stretched to the smallest detail. They practiced with locks and crowbars, scavenged from abandoned barns, timing themselves, and taking notes. Mike Foster even kept a dog whistle in his pocket, studying Max's patterns for weeks so he knew how to distract or silence him. Surveillance was so thorough that neighbors assumed the battered sedan parked 2 streets over belonged to an out-of-town cousin or contractor. Their camouflage was nearly perfect. Ordinary faces, old clothes, always moving at dusk or just before dawn, when curiosity among locals was at its lowest. Ultimately, the decision was made to strike just after a local festival, assuming townsfolk would be distracted and the Andersons exhausted. Late that chosen evening, the 4 men met in the abandoned stone cave, the future site of the crime's worst horrors, and finalized roles. Steve and Jimmy would disable power, cut camera lines, and force entry. Mike and Kane would act as spotters, and later, in the dead of night, help subdue and move the victims. When Jack and Mia returned home that night, nothing appeared amiss. Yet behind their house, shadows moved with purpose. A crude homemade silencer was affixed to a cheap pistol, carried as both threat and insurance. Kane slipped through the chicken wire, Max distracted by a treat dosed in sedative. The gang broke the back window pane, reached through, unlatched the door, and flooded inside under the cover of blackout. The Andersons didn't even have time to scream. What happened next was a blur of orchestrated savagery. Jack was forced to the kitchen, duct tape over his mouth and wrists, suffering blows when he struggled. Mia, terrified, was separated, dragged into the living room, threatened, her pleas ignored. The intent was always clear. No witnesses, no mercy. A demonstration to the world that they, these four forgotten boys, could take and destroy at will. Personal belongings were methodically collected, electronics yanked out, identifying documents bundled together to be shredded, burned, or dumped later. Money was a secondary motivation. They emptied drawers for bank cards, PIN numbers feverishly demanded and written on receipts. But even after valuables were gathered, the gang's rage burned on, manifesting in angry vandalism, cruel remarks, and violence that went far beyond what was needed for subduing or theft. The destruction was symbolic as much as practical, a grotesque act intended to erase not only Jack and Mia as people, but the sense of safety the community had always taken for granted. By the time the gang dragged Jack and Mia from their house, the Andersons' home was unrecognizable. Upturned furniture, splintered wood, streaks of blood, and disarray where there had once been warmth and welcome. The couple, bound and battered but still alive, were hustled out the back, into the silent expanse where no neighbor could see or hear. Max's lifeless body marked the route to the battered truck, inside which Jack and Mia were thrown, surrounded by the familiar scent of their own belongings, now just trophies for their tormentors. The drive to the cave was a blur of panic, anger, and desperation. Steve swerved around moonlit corners while Mike and Jimmy barked orders, each moment punctuated by the cold certainty that nobody would dare follow them so deep into the woods after midnight. At the echoing mouth of the stone cave, chosen for its isolation and the nightmarish privacy it offered, the men parked, dragged the Andersons into the core chamber, and set to work locking the crime scene down. Duct tape, rope, and the butt of a pistol replaced all pretense of control. What followed was hours of violence, blow after blow, threats and humiliation, every act a twisted attempt at asserting dominance and inflicting unforgettable terror. Yet even in their pain, Jack and Mia fought to the very end. Scratches on the cave wall, fingernail marks gouged into stone, clumps of hair torn free, all became forensic markers of a desperate struggle for life. When exhaustion finally stilled the Andersons' hands, the men began their final, purposeful erasure. Valuable evidence, clothing, IDs, photographs, even wedding rings, was burned, ripped, scattered through the forest, or later dumped in the river. It was not merely enough for the gang to kill. They wanted to strip the couple of existence, too. Their aim was to send a message to the world that in a place as sleepy and safe as Red Oak, fear could be made real by force of cruel will. Mike Foster scrawled obscenities and ritual symbols on cave walls with his knife, a self-congratulatory gesture both sick and illuminating of the psychological depths from which this crime had grown. Before fleeing, Kane doused Mia's favorite dress, what was left of it, with lighter fluid, and Steve lit it with the engraved lighter later recovered by police. The torch cast flickering, monstrous shadows against the walls, sending the men tumbling back into the dawn, convinced they had covered every trace, destroyed every last echo of what had happened. Unbeknownst to them, they left behind all the evidence that would become their undoing: DNA on scraps of rope, prints in mud and blood, the broken camera lens and torn scraps Jack used in a final, desperate attempt at self-defense. Their careful plan was ultimately as flawed as their understanding of justice, and as thorough as it seemed, it could not overcome the indelible marks that love, fear, and last hope always leave behind. In the weeks after the crime, as investigators unearthed these traces, the full horror and the delusion of the perpetrators came to light. The plan was cruel, detailed, but always destined to unravel by the very humanity their violence tried to erase. The downfall of the criminal gang. The obliteration of the Notorious gang that had terrorized Red Oak was neither cinematic nor swift, but unfolded with the somber realities of small-town justice, meticulous investigation, and the weight of community outrage. In the days following the horrifying discoveries at both the Andersons' farmhouse and the Stone Cave, local law enforcement, aided by state investigators and federal authorities, mounted an aggressive manhunt spanning counties and crossing into neighboring states. Despite their careful planning, none of the perpetrators were prepared for the relentless pursuit that followed. Their first mistake was underestimating the collective memory and anger of Red Oak. As news of the Anderson tragedy spread, doors previously indifferent swung wide with stories and tips. A gas station attendant recalled a nervous young man buying cleaning supplies in the early hours. A farmer remembered seeing an unfamiliar car speeding past the edge of his fields that same night. These seemingly minor details, connecting times, faces, and license plates, provided investigators with a crucial digital and analog map tracing the criminal's flight. Once the gang realized the scope of the manhunt, panic set in. Mike Foster, their leader, insisted on ditching the battered sedan that had featured on so many surveillance cameras. They abandoned it in a motel parking lot north of the state line, splitting the remaining cash and scattering on foot. Jimmy and Kane taking to the freight rail lines, Steve and Mike hiding out in a disused grain silo. Paranoia gripped them. Every drone of a search helicopter overhead stoked fresh anxiety. Yet despite constant shuffling, they could not outrun the inexorable tightening of the investigative net. Law enforcement employed every resource: forensic phone pings, highway surveillance, and even trained dogs tracking the faint scent trails left across fields or in abandoned shacks. Media coverage was unrelenting, with images of the accused flashing on television screens in diners, grocery stores, and rural churches. Social media lit up with community groups, shareable flyers, and real-time alerts. For a town unused to violence, Red Oak revealed an unexpected tenacity to confront its own trauma head-on. The first to be apprehended was Kane Thomas. Cold, hungry, and alone after losing contact with Jimmy, he drew suspicion when attempting to pawn a watch in a roadside store. The shopkeeper, wary of the nervous, battered young man, recognized him from the sheriff's circulating flyer. She quietly triggered a silent alarm, stalling Kane with idle conversation until deputies arrived. When they cuffed him, there was little protest. He simply stared through red-rimmed eyes, murmuring a single phrase: "It wasn't supposed to end like this." Kane's arrest marked a tipping point. Under pressure and worn down by fatigue, he gave up locations and details, desperate for leniency and overwhelmed by remorse. His cooperation led to Jimmy Brooks, discovered not far from a closed train depot, shivering beneath a railroad trestle. Jimmy tried to bolt, but exhausted and outnumbered, he was swiftly subdued. In the cruiser's back seat, he screamed at passing cornfields, his bravado finally collapsing in a cacophony of apologies and self-pity. The final manhunt for Mike Foster and Steve Miller was more tense. They'd holed up in the grain silo, surviving on vending machine snacks and bottled water, laying low as days stretched into weeks. But their hunger and escalating infighting made them sloppy. Their presence was betrayed by a restless hound, barking at a ventilation shaft, and the sharp-eyed property owner who called the sheriff after seeing movement where there ought not be any. The arrest was a textbook operation. Tactical officers surrounded the silo, loudspeakers announced the warrant, and within minutes, both Mike and Steve were in custody, gaunt and dirt-smeared. Steve, by then riddled with guilt, quickly broke down under questioning, confessing the scale and horror of the crime. Mike, still defiant, maintained an icy glare, until confronted with the mountain of evidence, his resolve faltered, and he clammed up, requesting a lawyer. The legal reckoning and community impact. The trial that followed was the largest in Oak County history, drawing reporters and spectators from across the region. Security was tight. Residents demanded justice in packed town hall meetings, and the courthouse square became a place of candlelight, vigils, and mourning. The prosecution's case was airtight. Never before had so much forensic, digital, and testimonial evidence aligned so completely. Testimonies from forensic experts detailed every haunting trace left on the cave walls, every torn receipt and blood stain charted in excruciating detail. Jurors recoiled as they viewed recovered video, crime scene photos, and especially the Andersons' fragmented belongings. But it was perhaps Mary Anderson, Jack's mother, who offered the trial's most gut-wrenching moments. Her quiet, steady recounting of the last breakfast she'd set for her son left many in the gallery. Hardened attorneys, local press, even bailiffs, in silent tears. Each defendant faced a barrage of charges: double homicide, kidnapping, aggravated assault, destruction of evidence, and multiple counts of burglary, conspiracy, and animal cruelty. Despite attempts by defense lawyers to portray the home lives and mental states of the four men as mitigating factors, the evidence was irrefutable and the community's pain palpable. When the verdicts were handed down, the air in the courthouse was electric, guilty on all counts. Sentencing was severe, multiple consecutive life sentences for Foster and Miller, with Brooks and Thomas receiving similarly harsh penalties, reflecting the degree of participation and post-crime cooperation. The judge's closing remarks echoed the feelings of the entire county. "Let this stand as testimony that no matter how dark the act, justice, steady, patient, and thorough, will find its way." Ripples of change. Yet the story did not end with convictions. As the four men were led out of court, heads bowed, their faces became forever etched into the collective memory of Red Oak, not as monsters, but as warnings. The tragedy prompted soul-searching sessions in church basements and school board meetings. Mental health resources increased, community watch programs were implemented, and local leaders pledged to never let such isolation, anger, and despair fester unchecked. For a long time, the Anderson house, now vacant, stood as a silent monument, its porch light left on each night in memory. The stone cave was sealed, its history irrevocably changed. New families who moved in joined neighbors at annual memorials for Jack and Mia, where stories of kindness and resilience replaced, little by little, the ache of loss. Law enforcement officers who had once responded to cattle disputes and weather calls found themselves forever altered, bearing the scars of what had happened, but also the pride of having seen justice done, step by difficult step. For Mary Anderson and the rest of Red Oak, closure was never total, but hope began to bloom anew. Where the gang once sowed fear and ruin, the town chose, not easily but defiantly, to remember love, to band together, and to start again. The aftermath of the Anderson tragedy sent irrevocable ripples through Red Oak and far beyond, challenging not just the town, but also the very conscience of rural America. As the court cases closed and the headlines faded, what lingered was a changed landscape, one heavy with the knowledge of how easily safety, innocence, and community spirit can be fractured, and how communities strive, stubbornly and tenderly, to piece themselves back together. A town changed forever. Red Oak wasn't the same from the day word spread about Jack and Mia's disappearance. The sense of routine, of church bells, shared casseroles, and neighborly trust became tinged with hesitation. Morning joggers glanced over their shoulders now. Children's laughter was no longer left to drift unsupervised across open fields. Yet the town did not simply retreat in fear. In fact, the Anderson tragedy became a call to action. For the first time in years, the lines at community town halls stretched out the door. Parents demanded safer school bus routes. and neighbors who once nodded silently on Sundays found themselves sitting together for hours, speaking hard truths about safety, social support, and belonging. Honoring Jack and Mia. The Andersons' legacy was more than the sum of their dreams and losses. Vigils continued on their wedding anniversary, townsfolk leaving handwritten notes, favorite flowers, and jars of Mia's home-canned pickles on the steps of the now empty White House. The little barbecue shack that once defined their ambition was reopened, not to turn a profit, but rather to host monthly meals for families in need or those affected by violence elsewhere. Their story was folded into sermons and school projects, teachers and preachers alike using the memory of Jack and Mia as a lesson in kindness, vigilance, and the fragility of life. Community and the long road to healing for Mary Anderson and other bereaved families. Grief wasn't something to get over. It became a presence, sometimes beating softly like rain on a tin roof, sometimes crashing in as an unexpected sob in the cereal aisle. But they were never alone. Red Oak rallied around the Andersons, organizing meal chains, maintaining the Anderson home and garden, and establishing scholarships in the couple's names. Local leaders formed task forces focused on at-risk youth, mental health intervention, and more funding for after-school programs, all measures aimed at making sure the cycle of despair and violence was interrupted before it could be repeated. Even as wounds slowly scabbed over, some scars would never fully heal. Every mention of the stone cave or the Anderson property could hush a room or draw tears. Memorial murals appeared on grain silos and cafe walls, portraits of Jack laughing, Mia tending her plants, reminders that hope remained stubborn, even after grievous loss. Rippling outward. Lessons beyond Red Oak. National news coverage made the Anderson story resonate well beyond Nebraska. Newspapers from New York to Los Angeles carried editorials about rural tragedy, the small-town opioid crisis, and the gaps in America's social fabric through which too many forgotten boys fall. Law enforcement agencies from other states contacted Oak County for guidance on interagency cooperation, mental health screening, and forensic training for rural crime scenes. In larger cities, the tragedy gave rise to advocacy campaigns for better background checks, youth mentorship initiatives, and funding for domestic violence shelters. Slowly, Red Oak's trauma became a catalyst, however unwelcome, for nationwide dialogue about the costs of neglecting mental health, ignoring root causes of crime, and failing to nurture collective vigilance. College students cited the Anderson case in essays on restorative justice. Faith groups debated the meaning of forgiveness and the necessity for tougher sentencing. Authors, politicians, and activists, sometimes clumsily, but more often with grace, used the story to galvanize efforts for systemic change, the persistence of memory, and the promise of renewal. Despite outward progress, townspeople recognized the difference between recovery and forgetting. Jack and Mia's names were not only etched on a memorial bench by the school football field, but woven into everyday conversation, local history, no less vital than founding dates and tornado legends. Newcomers to Red Oak inevitably heard the story, and each retelling reinforced a common understanding. Safety is a shared duty, compassion, a collective promise. Children grew up learning not only to look both ways at crosswalks, but to look out for one another, fiercely, despite the risks. Teachers noticed more kindness among classmates, more invitations at lunch, more willingness to ask for help. The town's wounds fostered a new mindfulness about loneliness, anger, and trauma. First signs spotted early, met with calls to counselors or invitations to Sunday dinners rather than suspicion and avoidance. A changed America, and a home that refused to forget. The Anderson story, heartbreak bound in cornfields and church hymns, never left Red Oak. Some departing families couldn't bear the memories, but most stayed, planting new gardens, repainting old barns, and reaffirming the values the Andersons exemplified. Each summer, during the county fair, a moment was set aside for silent reflection, and children released doves for Jack and Mia. For Mary Anderson and all who loved her son and daughter-in-law, the ache was both unbearable and, with community support, just bearable enough. In the end, Red Oak did what small towns do best. It mourned together, rebuilt together, and kept faith, not just in the promise of justice, but in the stubborn continuity of kindness. The echoes of this heartbreaking American story reverberated, not as a cautionary tale of fear, but as a steadfast reminder of love, community, and the courage to begin again, even in the face of unthinkable loss, collective responsibility, and renewed vigilance. While the Anderson tragedy is a uniquely personal story, it served as a painful case study for all of rural America. It prompted hard questions and unpopular conversations about what more could be done, not just to chase criminals, but to notice the warning signs, to reach out before another young person slips below the surface of notice. At county meetings and statehouse hearings, Red Oak's mayor and residents testified about the reality they lived. The illusion that crime stops at city limits, or the tragedy has a particular ZIP code, was shattered forever. Families once skeptical about participating in town life began volunteering at the revitalized community center, enrolling kids in mentorship programs, and ejecting a new sense of pride into local institutions. Businesses contributed to scholarships and charities, and grandfathers took grandsons fishing, not just to share a quiet afternoon, but to listen for the stories left unsaid, to help break cycles of loneliness before they hardened into something dangerous. Mary Anderson's voice, Mary Anderson, who once tucked Jack in with gentle hands and handed pie through screen doors, became, against all wishes, a kind of local sage. She spoke at school assemblies and church gatherings, sometimes only reading aloud Jack or Mia's recipes, sometimes weeping openly in front of strangers for the children she lost. Parents, shaken by her story, found themselves holding their sons and daughters a little closer, lingering over bedtime stories and breakfast conversations. In one memorable column for the local paper, Mary wrote, "We walk through this sorrow, so no one else must." Hold your people tight. Notice the child with nowhere to go. Ask about the classmate who never gets chosen. Let's promise never to close our eyes, never to let this kind of darkness surprise us again. Her words, raw and authentic, helped many face their own pain, and more importantly, face each other across old fences, finding new ways to bridge the isolation that breeds despair. Red Oak reimagined. By the third anniversary, Red Oak had become a place where no one's struggle was ignored. A network of volunteers regularly checked on the elderly, teens organized peer support groups, and local law agencies partnered with social workers, turning away from a culture of mere punishment to one of prevention and connection. New families arrived, drawn by the town's stubborn hope. Some said they chose Red Oak precisely because the tragedy had pushed it to become better, more honest, more open, more vigilant. Annual days of remembrance were complemented by service projects, planting trees, dedicating reading rooms to Jack's memory, organizing bike rides and harvest festivals to raise funds for mental health education. The old barbecue shack transformed into a center for local mentoring, where kids learned not only recipes, but resilience, and spent afternoons hearing from elders, community members who had lived through hard years and come out stronger on the other side. The Andersons' tale, once whispered in fear, became the foundation for a new story, a story of remembrance, resolve, and renewal. The lingering questions and the answers found in each other. The ordeal left questions that may never be fully settled. How could this happen here? What warning bells went unheard? What little mercies might have changed fate's course? But among those questions grew a more enduring truth. the strength of a community that refuses to remain silent, that insists on learning, loving, and showing up, even long after the headlines fade. Red Oak's name, once splashed across national news as a symbol of horror, became something altogether different in the years that followed. A symbol of resilience, kindness, and the hard work of never letting tragedy have the last word. In the Andersons' honor, and in the memory of all lost to senseless violence, the people of Red Oak resolved to hold one another close, to offer help without judgment, and to rally around every person who risked becoming invisible.